Carter International, or really this is looking at Jimmy Carter's administration and looking at like their foreign policy basically. The first 2 years of Jimmy Carter's time in office are going to actually bring a lot of foreign policy successes. He was a newcomer into Washington politics, but in that way, it helps him because he's willing to work with like African, Asian, Latin American nations just on a basis of mutual respect. And he builds a lot of bridges to third world nations. For instance, he is the president that is going to start the transferring of the control of the Panama Canal back to Panama, which was completed by 2000. A lot of this deals with Carter's moral convictions. Jimmy Carter is famously a Baptist, and he was really concerned about like human rights around the globe. And as such, he would openly criticize nations who were abusing human rights. For instance, he criticized the Soviet Union for prohibiting free speech and denying citizens the right to immigrate. He'd even be willing to criticize like American allies, and he withheld economic aid from like South Africa, Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua, who all had long histories with like human rights abuses. We also see several other successes during this time period with he normalizes diplomatic relations with China, so that continuance of, Nixon's era and everything. He also would refuse to admit failure when it came to foreign relations. In fact, he managed to dissuade the two opposing leaders of Egypt and Israel together and eventually got the very formal treaty of the Camp David Agreement in 1979, which was a big deal because this basically normalized this relationship between Israel and their most powerful neighbor, Egypt, and could bring about some, at least vaguely, some peace to like the Middle East. By the way, this is a picture of Jimmy Carter in 2014. He has been the oldest president to live after leaving office, and this map is all of his foreign trips made during his presidency. However, we have to keep in mind that the Cold War is still going on during this time period. And the Soviet Union is famously going to ignore the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Accords. Then we get SALT II, or really the failure of SALT II. This was a strategic arms limitation treaty, thus SALT. And what it would have done is reduced both the United States and Soviet Union nuclear arsenals. Technically, this was actually made by the Ford administration, but it's going to meet a lot of stiff resistance in the Senate because a lot of senators felt like it left the United States vulnerable by getting rid of that much nuclear weaponry and everything. So SALT II was problematic in that it could potentially leave America vulnerable or even just looking vulnerable. And so to counter this criticism, Carter is actually going to step up defense spending. However, he is not going to manage to get SALT II to pass because basically any hope of it going through will end when Soviet Union troops would enter Afghanistan in December of 1979, and Afghanistan was a technically neutral Muslim nation that was on the southern border of the Soviet Union. So if you look at the left map, this is all of the different like states that make up the Soviet Union, and you can see then on the right map how that actually touches Afghanistan. The situation when looking at the Soviet Union and Afghanistan is actually very similar to the United States situation in Vietnam. In fact, a lot of times it's referred to as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. Basically, you have in Afghanistan a pro-Soviet government that was in trouble. You have a lot of citizen resistance against that government. So that government invited in the Soviet Union, who comes in, installs their own client government, but Soviet forces were just unable to suppress Afghan guerrilla warfare fighters. And It took about a decade for the Soviet Union to actually get back out of Afghanistan. The United States is involved minimally. It's more like through training with the CIA and et cetera, et cetera. But as much as there were problems with the Cold War and that Carter could have been seen as weak for allowing SALT II to pass or not getting it to pass, either way, it was kind of a lose-lose situation for him. What really is the biggest blow to his foreign policy is going to be Iran. Since 1953, the United States had backed Iran's monarch, the Shah Reza Pahlavi, who had basically modernized the economy in Iran, but he also had secret police that would jail and torture his political opponents. So the middle class in Iran despised this authoritarianism. And then you also get a lot of Muslim fundamentalists opposing the westernization and the influence of modernization. Think to modern times in America, how there's a huge pushback against like Easternization and allowing a lot of other religions that are not predominantly Christian into America because it feels like it's an otherworldly and it's taking over and it might push out, et cetera, et cetera. This is what's happening, but in the opposite direction in Iran, basically. And so what we get is in 1979, a revolution that topples the Shah in Iran, and you get a nominally democratic government. But you're seeing anti-American sentiment grow because a lot of these Muslim fundamentalists don't appreciate the westernization, modernization, and what they see as Americanization coming in and infiltrating their own values and their own culture. So after this revolution, the United States is actually going to allow the exiled Shah to seek medical treatment in New York. As a direct reaction to that, an Iranian mob is going to storm the United States Embassy in Tehran in 1979 on November 4th, and they're going to take 66 American hostages. This is known as the Iran hostage crisis. You also see lots of anti-American demonstrations of Iranians like burning effigies of Uncle Sam or wrapping American flags around garbage, or you can see here them like holding it up upside down and such. Now, Carter's administration initially is going to try like economic pressure against Iran and diplomacy, but basically the Iran government had no desire to accommodate America. Carter's also going to try to order an airborne rescue, but it's extremely difficult situation because the American embassy was located at the heart of the city and it's hundreds of miles from United States bases, and basically these kinds of attempts turns into fiasco and national embarrassment. We are going to see finally an agreement is reached on literally the eve of the 1980 election, and we will see the hostages gain their freedom after about 144 days being held hostage. And this is literally the moment like Ronald Reagan takes office as president. I should mention of the 66 hostages, actually 13 were released who were women and African Americans. One would be released later because they were sick, and then only 52 of them were held this whole time. Carter, he is blamed for problems outside of his control with things like the hostage crisis. Carter's also going to become in many ways more successful, or considered more successful, after his presidency is over, because he's going to really continue his work and preaching like humanitarian efforts around the world. And in fact, he earned a Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his continuing work. As of 2020, he still tries to talk globally about humanitarian efforts and like human rights and et cetera, et cetera. So, what is a one-sentence summary of Jimmy Carter and his administration?